I'm Roy Lee Lindsay with the North Carolina Pork Council, and I want everyone to remember bacon makes everything better.
Welcome back to another edition of the David Glenn Show here on the North Carolina Sports Network. I am Mike Waddell. He is David Glenn. And David, I tell you, with the Canes out of the playoffs, the Hornets not making the playoffs, we're still a few months away from college sports and football season and the Panthers and all that implies. What are you doing with your time these days? I mean, it is a pretty full calendar still of North Carolina sports here in the bold North State.
Yeah, it is always a little bit less busy in the summer months since we don't have a Major League Baseball team here in North Carolina yet. But we do get the U.S. Open in golf in Pinehurst here in June. As you mentioned, we have a bunch of teams in the NCAA Baseball Championship. So there's always stuff to talk about: college basketball, college football, the transfer portal. Lawsuits, unfortunately, in the sports context, are never too far away from the conversation. So it's a little slower at this time of year for sure. But you and I have a whole bunch of fun topics to dive into today.
We sure do. And I tell you, you mentioned the U.S. Open coming to Pinehurst. I've been to every U.S. Open in Pinehurst. And I tell you, I have to give kudos because you and I both travel to events all around the nation all the time. But the USGA, along with the group on the ground in Pinehurst, do the best job, phenomenal work in moving people around that traffic pattern down there. You're not going to drive like you do to a basketball game and park in a parking lot and just walk right in. You have to park off site, but they keep you moving the entire time from the time you leave your car to you get into the queue lines. You get on the bus, you immediately take off within 3 minutes, then you land at Pinehurst Resort and Country Club, get ready to walk through the big gates, and you are in. And that is an invaluable service that is provided, great customer service put forward by the USGA and, again, the folks at Pinehurst Resort.
Yeah, man, I've been to the Masters several times, and obviously if you either live near Augusta, Georgia, or you can get there easily, you enjoy that every single year, right? The Masters is one of the 4 major golf championships, but it doesn't move the way these other major golf championships move. It's in the same place every year. We get the U.S. Open only occasionally. We have great colleges, universities, pro teams here, but it's always fun when we're hosting the NCAA basketball tournament leading up to the Final Four, or as we speak, hosting various NCAA baseball regionals. We host a lot of other things across the great state of North Carolina. And it is an extra bonus given how well they run things in Pinehurst when we get the U.S. Open in golf down there.
It's going to be an exciting time that coming up, of course, on Father's Day weekend. But right now it's time to get into our spring cleaning here on the North Carolina Sports Network. And we have a lot of great topics. Let's tease those up. We're going to talk about the Atlantic Coast Conference's recent spring meetings down in the Sunshine State of Florida at Amelia Island. It's good that they were able to really persevere through those tough conditions down in Amelia Island. We have the ACC's ongoing lawsuits with Florida State and Clemson. We also have some college basketball topics and the prominent place our state has right now with the magnificent sport and the march to Omaha with college baseball. And DG, I know that you've been itching for quite some time to say 2 very specific words to our audience across North Carolina and beyond. So why don't we start right there?
The 2 words are thank you. And I mean all caps, all bold, thank you. According to the folks at YouTube, for example, Mike, only 1% of their channels have 10,000 or more subscribers. And because we have added about 8,000 subscribers in less than 3 months, we are knocking on the door of 10,000 as we speak. If the viewers who are not yet subscribed add themselves to our subscriber list today, they could be number 10,000. That's how close we are as we're conversing right now to that magical 10,000 mark. We had no idea when we created the North Carolina Sports Network last summer that we would get into the top 1% of all YouTube channels far before we even reached the 1-year anniversary. So the thank you is more broadly to the hundreds of thousands of people who are our viewers and our listeners and our readers at the ncsportsnetwork.com website. Some of those podcast numbers have been great for a long, long time, but our YouTube channel is new. So it's a very specific thank you to all of those involved in that very quickly rising number of our subscribers on that new YouTube channel. Also, of course, we profusely thank our sponsors all across the state of North Carolina, starting with our founding partner, the North Carolina Pork Council. So please, if someone out there likes some aspect of what we do and wants us to continue doing these things many years into the future, either become a North Carolina Sports Network sponsor yourself. It's actually far easier and less expensive to partner with us on this endeavor than it was most of the things I've done with major corporations and companies over the last 25 years or so. Or alternatively, not everybody is a decision maker who could be a sponsor to the North Carolina Sports Network. Alternatively, you could just keep eating pork products as a thank you to the North Carolina Pork Council. But also, and I'm serious about these things, it is very important when someone out there needs personal or commercial insurance here in North Carolina, please call our friends at Lawson Insurance. When you're moving or you need storage space, please call our friends at XL Moving and Storage here in North Carolina. If you're an executive hoping to manage your time better, please call our friend Emily Parks at Organize for Success. If you're looking for lunch or dinner in Raleigh, please try The Oak on Lake Boone Trail. If you're in the Wilmington area, please support Jimmy's Bar and King Neptune Restaurant right next door in Wrightsville Beach, and the Original Salt Works, a wonderful breakfast and lunch place on Oleander Drive in Wilmington. And of course, if you're seeking a financial services partner, please call my friend Mike Berard and his team at Stiefel, the Founders Group here in the Triangle part of North Carolina. The bottom line, as you know, Mike, whenever our readers, viewers, followers, listeners support any or all of those partners we just mentioned, they are automatically supporting us with what we do at the North Carolina Sports Network. So again, those two words, thank you to everyone for this amazing first year, which is not even over yet, but has been successful so far beyond our wildest dreams. Thanks to you, the listener, the viewer, the follower, the subscriber, and those great partners I mentioned earlier.
Man, it seems like a light year ago that we had Rod Brindamore on as our first guest back last July. And now one of our most recent episodes detailing the exploits of the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill Board of Trustees has gone over 9,000 views on YouTube. And as you said, we have strong numbers on our website, ncsportsnetwork.com, and also in our podcast. But to see those YouTube numbers go up, that is really the name of the game. And we sincerely say thank you to everybody, all of our sponsors, and the best is yet to come. And DG, you are constantly on radio shows all around the nation, especially here in the Southeast. And what are some of the real hot topics that have come out of those ACC annual spring meetings in May down in ritzy Amelia Island, Florida? And what were the questions that you were fielding that really got your mind percolating as to what will the future be of this grand old conference?
Yeah, Mike, that's a long list, but I'll try to get the basics out of the way first. Not just those hosts' questions, but sometimes just college sports fans that I run into in the neighborhood, so to speak. Amelia Island question number one was really simple. Were Cal and SMU and Stanford invited? Yes, they were there in Amelia Island. They were fully represented with coaches and administrators, just like everybody else, even though those three schools do not officially become members of the Atlantic Coast Conference until July 1st in the case of Southern Methodist and August 2nd in the cases of both Cal and Stanford coming in from the Pac-12. Obviously, a lot of the topics discussed at those meetings in May affect the upcoming 2024-25 academic year. So it was definitely necessary for all 18 ACC members to be in attendance. For anyone wondering, by the way, and ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips actually took some flack for not knowing the answer to this question. The arrival dates for the three incoming schools are different because they're coming from different leagues that have different rules and different deadlines and different expiration dates. For example, the Pac-12's grant of rights, everyone following these lawsuits knows that phrase, the Pac-12's grant of rights officially expires on August 1st, 2024, meaning later this year. So it made sense for the arrival of Cal and Stanford of the Pac-12 to be August 2nd, one day after the expiration of the Pac-12's grant of rights. Amelia Island question number 2. Yes, Clemson and Florida State were also fully represented and participated in every ACC meeting without exception. Many fans wondered, and I get it, if the ongoing lawsuits would prevent the Tigers or the Seminoles from being there, or they might complicate somehow their presence there or make them step out of certain meetings. No. In fact, I was told repeatedly by every source that I had down there that the 5 ongoing lawsuits were basically not even mentioned and certainly not explored behind closed doors in those conferences' various official meetings. Although obviously, as soon as those ACC officials or athletic directors, coaches, as soon as they stepped out from those meetings into the hallway or anywhere else media were present, the conversation often did turn back to the ongoing lawsuits, which we'll get to later in today's show. Almost everyone avoided public comment on that topic. I think Jim Phillips, the commissioner, was the only guy who said anything, and he didn't say much about the ongoing lawsuits other than they were damaging and they were unfortunate and they were unpleasant, etc. Just not his exact words, but the general tone of his comments. Behind closed doors, though, the ADs and the coaches and the other administrators were completely civil toward each other, with everyone basically taking the stance that the lawyers are going to continue to battle things out while the ADs have to continue the business of the league, the business of their individual schools, because no matter what happens with these lawsuits or any potential legal settlement at some point in the future, Clemson and Florida State obviously will be ACC members during this upcoming 2024-25 academic year at the very least. And there's a chance that they'll still be members in 2025-2026. Too early to know for sure. Again, we'll get to that later. Amelia Island question number 3. Yes, the Disney folks, meaning ABC, ESPN, ACC network representatives, they were all there in Amelia Island as well. They actually offered particularly good news about the ACC network's impressive distribution and revenue growth in recent years. Once that channel finally got pretty much full distribution, meaning on all the major satellite, cable, and other pay TV outlets. Remember that for a long time, Comcast, which to this moment remains one of the largest pay TV providers in all of the United States, with more than 14 million pay TV customers, Comcast did not carry the ACC network for those early years after the launch of that channel. That was really damaging. It minimized what the ACC was making. Obviously, before it even had a channel, it was falling behind the Big Ten and the SEC. They've had their channels much longer. But even once the ACC network launched, it didn't have full distribution for a while. Now that it does, and it is carried by basically every major provider, guess what? The ACC's annual revenues have improved significantly. In the 2022-23 academic year, the most recent year that these numbers are available, the ACC distributed an average of about $45 million per school to each of its full-time members. That improvement obviously does not close the gap the ACC has financially behind the Big Ten and the SEC. That 2022-23 year, the Big Ten's check to each of its full-time members, $60 million. The SEC's check, $51 million. Again, the ACC's check, $45 million. That's not crazy far behind the SEC right now, but as we've discussed many times, those gaps for the ACC behind the Big Ten, behind the SEC, those gaps are going to continue to grow because those leagues have new and improved media rights deals, and the ACC is stuck in that deal signed long ago that is on the books all the way through 2036. Put an asterisk on that. We'll get to that asterisk a little bit later. Amelia Island question number 4, and I only have 5, so we'll keep this moving. Another frequent question I got on all those shows I do was why the NCAA president, Charlie Baker, was there in Amelia Island. Now, I have been to Amelia Island. I was not physically there this year, but it It is a really ritzy, fun, cool, expensive place near Jacksonville, Florida, on the Atlantic coast of Florida. It's a beautiful place. It's a ritzy place. Every time I'm down there and money issues come up about college sports, I just roll my eyes because they're spending so much money to have these meetings in Amelia Island. But I'll put that aside for now. I don't know how often an active NCAA president has attended the annual ACC spring meetings in person, but it cannot possibly be a long list. I can promise you the times I've been there, there was no NCAA president on site. But Charlie Baker was there, mainly to explain to ACC officials and to try to get their vote at the time, how the proposed settlement in the House v. NCAA class action lawsuit is supposed to work. After those discussions, by the way, the ACC did vote as a league to approve that House settlement, which is worth almost $2.8 billion with a B. Charlie Baker discussed, among other things, how much of that $2.8 billion the NCAA was going to pay from its own funds, how much the schools themselves were going to have to contribute toward that settlement, and how a framework proposed in the settlement is going to work in coming years. That is a complicated topic, and it will be many months before a federal judge is even asked to approve this settlement. But the bottom line is this. The $2.8 billion settlement compensates former college athletes. The new framework that's part of the settlement, which is designed to compensate athletes in college moving forward, would allow NCAA schools to pay their athletes name, image, likeness, style money directly from their athletic department treasure chest. That is a first in the history of the NCAA, which is more than 100 years old. It's still not exactly going to be play for pay in the strictest sense. Schools will not be paying their athletes to actually play their sports. And those athletes will not be employees of the university under this proposed settlement. But it will be a brand new world where something like 20 to 22% of certain athletic department revenues, they haven't finalized all this yet, but media rights money would go into a certain bucket. Ticket sales money would go into that bucket. Other sports-related money go into that bucket. Not booster donations, though. So it's a type of, not all, but chunks of athletics-related revenue go into this pool. And then up to 20 or 22, whatever they decide, percent of that pool could be distributed on an annual basis by the schools directly to their athletes without violating NCAA amateurism rules. Again, all this is brand new. Each school would have autonomy, though, whether or not to go all the way to 20% or 22% or whatever the cap turns out to be. Which athletes and which sports are going to get how much money? You don't have to divide it equally. How about male versus female? How about football and men's basketball versus sports that don't create nearly as much revenue and don't turn profits in most cases? There's a long, long way to go before any of this becomes the new reality in college sports. The settlement framework also, by the way, would have new roster limits in each sport, but it would leave up to each school whether or not to make every player a full scholarship player. So, for example, football coaches are already going bananas over possibly losing their beloved walk-ons, who they think are part of the culture of the sport, and to some degree, they're definitely right. The current rules in football, remember, give everyone a scholarship limit of 85, but many schools have a football roster size of, let's say, 120 or so, which obviously leaves room for as many as 35 walk-ons, if you do that math. Those are among the many details that still have to be worked out before this settlement proposal is presented to the presiding judge in the case. Her name is Claudia Wilkins. She's a federal judge based in California who has had this case for a long time. Finally, Amelia Island question number 5. Got a lot of questions about a seemingly odd topic. Why was ESPN bracketologist Joe Lunardi speaking to ACC officials in Amelia Island this year? Now, Joe has a lot of haters for whatever reason. I've never really understood that. I don't mind bracketology. There are dozens of people who do it, some better than others. I've always thought if you don't like bracketology, if you don't like Joe Lunardi, just ignore them. Like no harm, no foul, right? There's no victim in that crime. But whatever. I'm not a hater of Joe, but there were a lot of eye rolls among fans and media when it came out that he spoke at these official ACC meetings at this wonderful ACC annual setting in Amelia Island. To me, it was easy to connect the dots. ESPN is the ACC's primary TV partner and has been for a long time. Joe Lunardi, of course, works for ESPN. ACC basketball coaches have been complaining a lot in recent years about what they believe are unfair bracketologist projections and overall lack of respect in the media for ACC basketball, and especially, of course, the NCAA Tournament Selection Committee not giving some ACC teams the benefit of the doubt when it matters most. That's on Selection Sunday. So Joe talked about various scheduling approaches, which I thought made a lot of sense. There is an art and a science to how you schedule things, and it didn't surprise me that that was a big part of Joe Lunardi's talk to the ACC athletic directors and basketball coaches. He also talked about what the selection committee has valued most historically when that committee is evaluating resumes. That also makes a lot of sense to me, and I see some value in that. But he apparently also talked, Mike, about his personal projections for next season in ACC basketball, and even which ACC teams next year were likely to be viewed as quad 1 wins or quad 2 wins, etc. Now, I can promise you, I think I follow ACC basketball about as closely as anyone on the planet for much of these last 37 years. And I fully admit that I would have a hard time telling you which teams 9 months from now will end up being a quad 1 candidate or a quad 2 candidate if you're able to beat them. Obviously, I mean, there's a starting point that you don't need my expertise or Joe's to understand. The starting point is probably Duke and Carolina, probably would be that caliber of opponent that would be a resume builder for you in the ACC if you can beat them in men's basketball this coming season. But with all due respect to Joe Lunardi or even any other media member, and there's some great folks out there on college basketball who are incredibly knowledgeable, who among us has such an uber accurate crystal ball 9 months before Selection Sunday? I mean, it is basically impossible. Last year at this time, for example, most of us would have said Duke and Carolina will end up as top 25 teams. And we would have been correct on those, even, 12 months in advance. Last year at this time, for example, most of us would have also had other favorites in the ACC. In my case, I had Clemson as an NCAA tournament team, NC State and Virginia as NCAA tournament caliber teams a year ago at this time. And those eventually proved to be right. Shout out to the Wolfpack for making us look good there with their final flurry. But for example, I was personally way off on the Miami Hurricanes, who I thought would be really good and finished 14th in a 15-team league last year. I was also pretty far off on Virginia Tech and some others. So that second part or third part, if you want to call it that, of Joe's visit with the ACC didn't make as much sense to me. There is an art to the scheduling aspect, and maybe Joe helped with that. There's certainly plenty of history on what the selection committee likes to see. I'm sure Joe helped with that. But I have a pretty good track record over 37 years with my preseason predictions on ACC basketball. And if I was speaking to the ACC head coaches, I would start with the idea that it's basically impossible to know 9 months in advance how many ACC teams are going to end up being true resume builders if you can figure out a way to beat them next season. Beyond Duke and Carolina, it is at best an educated guessing game, and the ACC's head coaches are actually pretty good at that game themselves without help from Joe Lunardi or me or any other media member for that matter. Michael Berard, Managing Director Investments with the Founders Group at Stifel, works with a select group of high net worth individuals and institutions to develop and implement investment plans tailored to their specific objectives and risk tolerances. If you are interested in highly personalized, well-researched guidance and outstanding personal service, you can contact Michael at 984-364-2002. That's 984-364-2002. Stifel Nicholas and Company Incorporated, member SIPC and NYSE.
David, you've covered the ACC spring meetings for a number of years, and most of the things that are talked about, as you've alluded to, are fairly predictable. Were there any things that really stood out to you or caught you by surprise?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I'm not great at that, as you know, but here are 4 things that come immediately to mind. Number 1, the ACC also is very worried about what it sees as an ongoing perception problem for the ACC football brand. We are not going to revisit today the unprecedented exclusion of an undefeated ACC champion, 13-0 at the time, Florida State football team from last year's college football playoff. I believe the Seminoles could have gotten in. I also accept that the committee had rules allowing them to factor in injuries and other things that at least left their conclusion legally sound and not really vulnerable to a legal challenge the way some absurd Florida politicians tried to make it about that. But without getting into those details, the league and its coaches are still worried about whether its top teams will get the benefit of the doubt, if needed, in this new and even more lucrative 12-team version of the college football playoff, which begins this year. Remember, this fall of 2024. I actually thought Wake Forest football coach Dave Clawson put it best, as he often does on many topics, when he said this, quote, "What we want to avoid is having an ACC school ranked 13th by the committee that should be ranked 10th or 11th. Just to make sure everybody understands, obviously, if you're 13th, you miss the college football playoff. And you miss the enormous multi-million-dollar payday, both as a league and as a school. And if you're the 10th or 11th, as Coach Clawson said, that means you make the new version of this expanded playoff. And the league and the school both do get those big-time paydays, which actually increase if you win your way toward the end of that bracket. Again, a lot of this comes down to scheduling decisions and obviously posting double-digit win totals in the sport of football. I'm not sure how much you can tweak your approach or change your reputation with these philosophical conversations at the ACC's annual meetings, but it certainly was an important topic in the eyes of those ACC athletic directors and football coaches in Amelia Island, because there is a lot of money on the line in this new expanded version of the college football playoff. Number 2, a majority of the soon-to-be 18 ACC head basketball coaches now do favor the expansion of the NCAA basketball tournament. And that definitely has not been the case for, I'll say, the large majority of my 37 years covering this league, although the trend definitely has been changing lately. If I asked this question 15 years ago, it would have been leave it at 68, with a couple guys maybe saying they wanted to expand it. Usually the coaches whose teams are near the bubble are the ones that want to expand the tournament. But fast forward to 2024, Pitt coach Jeff Capel, one of my favorite interviewees, if you will, maybe of all time, just an incredibly impressive guy, thoughtful guy, wonderful person. He is one of those who has come around on the idea of, as a former Duke player, right? And a former Duke assistant coach who has seen the evolution of college basketball through the eyes of a player, an assistant coach, and now as a long-time and successful head coach. Jeff Capel's a great example of a guy who's come around on the idea of expanding the big dance beyond that current 68-team field. Florida State's Leonard Hamilton, Miami's Jim Larinaga, they have joined us on the David Glenn Show probably dozens of times each over the years. They both have favored March Madness expansion for a long, long time. UVA's Tony Bennett, another friend of the program, said he would be okay with a slight expansion of the field. So you have to make him a yes, but he doesn't want to see it grow too much. Virginia Tech's Mike Young would be an example, one of the few in Amelia Island this year, or that I caught on the phone in recent months. He would vote against NCAA tournament expansion. Although, to be clear, I did not have answers. I don't even know some of the new expansion teams' basketball coaches. Some of them, yes. I don't know Kyle Smith, for example, out on the West Coast. Hope to get to know him. I don't have an 18-person docket here, but it was interesting to me that clearly a large majority definitely favors expanding the NCAA tournament field. And when a league that is very influential in basketball, the ACC, has a large majority of its men's basketball coaches advocating for that position, I think it matters. And my best guess is that in part because of the transfer portal, and especially the rule changes that allow almost all transfers to be immediately eligible rather than sitting out as they had to do for decades. Because of all these factors, I think there are going to be very serious conversations about expanding the NCAA men's basketball tournament during the current March Madness TV contract, which goes through 2032. A lot of times you say, well, we're going to wait till the end of a TV deal, and only when we're near the end will we discuss this expanded format. I don't think that's going to happen here. There's too much support for expansion. I'll leave my own opinion for another time. There's too much need right now for another major revenue increase in these college athletic departments, in part because of that House case settlement I mentioned, for these schools and athletic directors and presidents and chancellors to wait another 8 years to turn on that larger revenue stream. These TV partners will pay more for an expanded NCAA tournament. There's no doubt about it. And remember, the NCAA itself gets more than 90% of its annual revenue directly or indirectly from a single event, the NCAA men's basketball tournament. I'll say that again. The NCAA's annual revenues, more than 90%, are tied directly or indirectly to a single event that takes place mostly in March every year, the NCAA men's basketball tournament. So college basketball fans, I know many of you do not like change, expect to see very serious conversations about expanding March Madness in the coming months. Number 3, the most interesting comment in the entire month of May from the lips of ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips, in my eyes, came at those ACC meetings in Amelia Island, where he spoke briefly about the league's ongoing relationship with its, of course, longtime primary TV and streaming partner, Disney/ESPN. Phillips said the following, and I'll read it because I don't want to miss any words. We're working with them, meaning Disney/ESPN, on a piece of the contract. The partnership is not going away or being affected in a negative way at all, unquote. Again, the partnership is not going away or being affected in a negative way at all. Now, Jim Phillips kind of scurried away soon after saying those comments, so I don't believe there was time for any follow-ups. Although he did not specify exactly what he meant, those words were an obvious reference, in my eyes, to questions about ESPN's February 2025 deadline, that is only 8 months away as we speak, when, according to those who have seen the TV contract, Disney/ESPN has to notify the ACC by February 2025 whether it will exercise its option for the next 9 years of the deal, meaning the 2027-28 academic year all the way through 2035-36, the end of the deal. Now, I've seen the grant of rights, I've seen the ACC bylaws, I've seen all sorts of other things, sometimes through Freedom of Information Acts. I have not personally seen the TV contract, which is the subject of ongoing lawsuits because it's private. And even if you're a member of the ACC, you got to go there in person just to be able to see it. And that's a subject of litigation as we speak. This decision is obviously important to ESPN. And I don't know the nature of it, again, because I haven't seen Florida State and Clemson say it's an opt-out clause. I haven't seen the contract language, so even as a contract attorney myself, I can't tell you exactly how it is worded because I haven't seen the contract. That decision is obviously important to ESPN, hugely important to the future of the ACC, and hugely important to just the relationship in the future of those parties. If Phillips is right that, quote, the partnership is not going away and will not be affected in a negative way, that would be very good news for the stability of the ACC, even though the terms of that deal are so much lower than what the Big Ten and the SEC are getting from their TV partners. The Big 12 is not a Tier 1 conference, but it's doing fine. And actually, most recently, the Big 12 schools didn't even get as much money from their league office as the ACC schools did. So you can live on that Tier 1B, if you want to call it that, and the ACC would survive on Tier 1B, even if Florida State and or Clemson were to leave the league. Why do I say all of this? Because moving forward with Big 12 type TV money, which is what the ACC is getting right now with its ESPN contract, is a lot better than falling further down the financial ladder, or in the worst case scenario, inching toward a Pac-12 style disaster. That league, the Pac-12, is now basically dead. The name exists. 2 schools still exist in it, but that league is now basically dead, in part because it alienated both ESPN and Fox when it was asking for too much TV money for a conference whose fans just do not watch college football in anything close to the numbers that Big Ten fans and SEC fans watch college football. The ACC's number, by the way, is much closer to the Big 12, which is why I've told you all along, the primary reason the ACC TV deals are so far behind the Big Ten and the SEC is not mismanagement. And I'd be happy to go in a courtroom and prove to any judge what I'm talking about. Whether or not or to what degree you claim mismanagement, the starting point is that Big Ten and SEC fans watch college football in much larger numbers than ACC and Big 12 fans. I could prove that to a group of kindergartners or the United States Supreme Court and everybody in between. It's in the numbers, and TV partners pay for those numbers. That's the starting point of the negotiations. The Big Ten and the SEC over many decades have just developed a much deeper rooted football TV audience than those other 2 leagues, and certainly any other league. Fourth and finally, last and definitely not least, I had 5 different ACC sources tell me last month, the month of May, that the league has no incentive to settle its ongoing lawsuits right now with Clemson or Florida State, at least at this stage of the process. I asked one in the month of May. I used this word, zero incentive, really? And his answer was 0. I asked another in a different conversation with a different source. Absolutely no incentive. That's how I worded my question. His answer, absolutely no incentive. 2 different people, worded 2 different ways, same bottom line. And remember, most, if not all, of the ACC people that I talk with know that I became a lawyer here in North Carolina in 1994, an eternity ago, and that contract law specifically was one of my main areas of practice for almost 2 decades. In fact, some of them have asked me questions, just casually, about various sports-related lawsuits and legal issues over the years. But I want to add one thing really quickly, just to be clear about this, because I've been around for a long time. Whereas I do believe that my ACC sources, I do believe they're being honest with me when they say that the league is not currently interested in settling these cases anytime soon. These are people who, to the best of my knowledge, have never lied to me, in some cases over more than a decade. I think it is also true, and I'm always honest with my audience, that when the time comes, some point down the road, for the ACC side to seriously consider a legal settlement, I know people out there are saying they're considering it right now. I believe those people are wrong. They will be, those ACC folks, some of whom are my sources, they will be under absolutely strict orders to not share that position with anybody, including me or anyone else in the media. Why? Because you never want the other side to know that you're interested in settling, because that reduces your leverage at the negotiating table. Just common sense, right? As I have said many, many times over these past 6 months, a settlement, and not some sort of judicial conclusion in a courtroom, a settlement is the most likely ending for these lawsuits. You don't chain Florida State or Clemson to a chair and force them to stay in the ACC, right? They're going to leave. Certainly the Seminoles are going to leave, and the question becomes, at what cost do the Seminoles leave? It's going to happen. We're just not sure when, and we're not sure under what terms. The ACC wants to enforce these various contracts, including the grant of rights and the exit fee. Florida State lawyers and Clemson lawyers are basically trying to wiggle out of contracts that they know their presidents, their chancellors, their athletic directors, their decision makers all signed on to willfully and with an open mind and a clear understanding that they were binding themselves or their media rights to the ACC through 2036. Anybody who doesn't think that's the case, I ask you one question. Show me a shred of evidence that anyone at any of those schools came up with the idea that they could leave whenever they wanted without penalty prior to these lawsuits. Show me an email, a conversation between a husband and a wife. Show me a text. Show me any of those things from 2013, 14, 15, 16, 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22. Show me a shred of evidence that they all thought they were signing up for something different than binding themselves and their media rights to the ACC through 2036. I asked that question because those of you who are honest with yourselves know no such evidence exists. They spoke as if they were binding themselves. That is in the public record. They emailed each other as if they were binding themselves. There is documentary evidence of those words from those athletic directors and those university presidents and those chancellors, including at Clemson and Florida State. They're trying to get off on a series of technicalities. That's the bottom line. It's okay if you have accepted that. It's okay if you haven't accepted that. But these legal arguments from Clemson and Florida State are seeking loopholes. They are not really suggesting that that's what they thought they were signing in 2013 or 2016. And smart people know that I am right about that. If the lawyers, everybody knows how this will go through your common sense, but I'll mention it anyway. If the lawyers for Clemson and Florida State really believe they're going to win ultimately on the merits of this case, they really don't have an incentive to settle anytime soon, right? Similarly, if the ACC lawyers remain confident in their most important legal positions, then their side has no incentive to settle anytime soon. And I believe the reports out there that are saying a settlement is imminent I think they're incorrect. At some point, one side or the other is going to lose confidence in one or more of their most important legal positions, and that is when a settlement becomes much more likely. If it's the ACC side that maintains confidence in its positions, any settlement offer is going to be for a really, really high number. Hundreds of millions of dollars each for Clemson and Florida State to leave or buy back their media rights or whatever. Alternatively, if it is the Clemson or FSU side that gains confidence in their positions because of judges' various decisions as these trials continue, well, then the settlement offer would be at a much lower number, of course. All we know for sure is that when it comes to a settlement, and it probably will, it's not going to be $500 million each to leave, a number that Florida State has included in its various legal filings, but it is also not going to be $0 either. Where does it end up? Again, in my opinion, it depends on how these lawsuits continue to evolve. And I think some of the statements about where they're going are premature at best and wildly irresponsible at worst. I am a better person and a more effective business owner for having known and learned from Emily Parks over many years now. Emily's company, Organize for Success, helps multi-passionate business owners and executives bring harmony to all the layers of their lives, from work to side projects, from friends and family to hobbies, community, and beyond. With Emily's help, you too can make every minute matter. She helps you determine what earns your time and how to efficiently accomplish what matters. One of the many things I love about Emily is that she does not impose her will on her clients. She listens to them. That way she can better help them cultivate the lives they want to live. You can set up a complimentary call with Emily today by visiting organizeforsuccess.com.
David, speaking about lawsuits, what should ACC or just college sports fans in general know about recent developments in those ACC cases, and what should they be looking for over these summer months?
Well, a few things come to mind here, Mike. Number one, I'll try to hit 3 points. Number one, UNC's position in all of this is a lot different than the positions of Clemson and Florida State. And as a result, fans should not expect the Tar Heels to file a lawsuit against the ACC anytime soon. As I have seen in my inbox, I mean, maybe hundreds of Clemson and Florida State fans telling me why the Tar Heels should do this or that. Either they don't understand UNC's position or they're only looking at the world through the eyes of their own school, which I get, but it also just leads to some ridiculous conclusions. A lot of fans know that the Tar Heels joined the Tigers and the Seminoles in voting against the league's additions of Cal and SMU and Stanford. That's why asking about the Tar Heels in this context is certainly a fair question, right? Those were the three schools that didn't want the ACC to expand the way it did. They're the only three that voted no. Two of those three have filed lawsuits against the ACC. The Tar Heels, of course, have not. Now, a lot of fans do understand correctly that UNC is seen by both the Big Ten and the SEC as a very intriguing expansion candidate. The Tar Heels have both a statewide and a national following. They're a top 5 public university, according to most of those rankings. They have a top 10 athletic department most years in the Directors' Cup, which is an all-sports competition they do every year. They are an iconic national brand, and importantly, UNC also would allow either the Big Ten or the SEC to add the state of North Carolina, which is the 8th or 9th most populous state in the entire country, to the conference footprint of either of those leagues, which is still a huge factor in how conference realignment works, even though streaming numbers and TV numbers are becoming more and more important gradually, and pure geography is becoming less and less important. It does matter when you're expanding your geographic footprint. Obviously, Florida State and Clemson would not add to the SEC's footprint because that league already has the Florida Gators and the South Carolina Gamecocks. These things matter. They aren't the only issue. They're not the only thing that's weighed in the equation, but they do matter. What is very, very, very different about UNC compared to Clemson and Florida State is that UNC is a public university in the same state that just gave the Atlantic Coast Conference $15 million in taxpayer money during the relocation of its headquarters from Greensboro, North Carolina, to Charlotte, North Carolina. Clemson and Florida State obviously do not have that political complication as they were weighing their options months ago. The same influential North Carolina politicians who approved those taxpayer funds also appoint members of the UNC Board of Trustees, which immediately governs UNC Chapel Hill, and the UNC Board of Governors, the broader umbrella organization that governs the entire state university system. Clemson and Florida State don't have that practical complication as they weighed their various options. UNC also has a neighbor just down the road, NC State, that is also a large, influential public university, meaning an extension of the state government. They approve the Wolfpack's annual budget, right, as a university. And it's a university as well, NC State, with a lot of supporters in the North Carolina legislature, just as the Tar Heels have a lot of supporters in the North Carolina legislature. But many of these folks don't want to see the Wolfpack damaged financially or left behind in any way by some collapse or reduction in the influence of the ACC. Clemson and Florida State do not have that complication, right? In Clemson State, South Carolina is a member of the SEC. In FSU State, Miami's in the ACC, but it's a private university. Miami is not governed by the state of Florida, right? So even if FSU's departure damages the Hurricanes and others left behind in the ACC, it's not a matter for the state legislature there, again, because Miami is a private university. Just as Duke and Wake Forest here in North Carolina are private universities, are there plenty of legislatures who like to see good things for Duke and Wake here in North Carolina? Absolutely. Do they govern the budgets of those universities? Absolutely not. Clemson and Florida State don't have that complication. UNC, with fellow ACC member NC State right down the road, fellow public university, does have that complication. UNC also has already been told by the state's Board of Governors, that superseding governing body that I mentioned, that if Carolina wants to change conference affiliation, it's already been told it must make a presentation to the Board of Governors and essentially convince them that it would be the right move, whether to the Big Ten or the SEC. Clemson and Florida State do not have that complication. And oh, by the way, UNC for the past 100 years did not have that complication. It's only relatively recently that the Board of Governors adopted a policy that requires the Tar Heels, or the Wolfpack for that matter, to make a presentation before them if they decide to change their conference affiliation. That has not been the case for 100 years. It is the case now. Beyond all of that, Clemson and Florida State already have had their internal stay or go debates, right? Both among decision makers, but also in the fan bases. And whereas I'm sure it's not unanimous, they ultimately came to a consensus that they wanted out. UNC has not yet come to that consensus. Not among the decision makers, not among the fans, not among the board of governors, the board of trustees, athletic director Bubba Cunningham, the interim chancellor. There's a lot of different ingredients in that stew, if you like, and it is far from unanimous. I can promise you that. And I don't believe there's anything close to a consensus the way Florida State and Clemson over a period of years ultimately did come to a consensus that they wanted to sue the ACC. And in the Seminoles case, they just desperately want out as soon as possible. And in the Tigers case, at the very least, they want clarity so that they can leave at a more understandable price than the unpredictable price that we have right now. At some point, if the Clemson and FSU lawsuits lead to small departure costs, let's say somehow, hypothetically, they each get out for $100 million instead of $400 million. Well, then UNC's decision makers take an issue that's on the back burner right now and bring it to the front burner because they're forced to make a decision. I believe if Carolina is forced to make that decision someday, they will have off their offers from both the Big Ten and the SEC when that day comes or if that day comes. But we're just not at that point in the process yet here in North Carolina. I understand why it's different in Florida and in South Carolina, but that's why you're not going to see UNC join Clemson and Florida State anytime soon. Lawsuit issue number 2. When we were having these discussions last year, neither Clemson nor Florida State was certain, in my opinion, after talking to people at both places, neither was certain that it had a landing place in either the Big Ten or the SEC if they left the ACC. Now, of course, you can have casual conversations. You can get initial feedback. We know that both Clemson and Florida State were told, you're not going to get an official offer to anything until you clean up your legal mess. And that's why these lawsuits are ongoing, because these other leagues want to know what they're getting. I mean, do you have all your media rights? You got to know. You need more certainty. And you're not going to have that certainty until there's a legal settlement or a judicial conclusion to these cases. And we're not near that. I don't believe we're anywhere near that right now. So whereas last year, I believe for the 2023 calendar year, if not all of it, most of it, they weren't sure where they were going to land. And remember, the Big 12 is not really a more lucrative option than the ACC. I mean, you could argue with that, but the numbers are pretty darn similar. It is, of course, a huge financial leap if you get an invitation to either the Big 10 or the SEC or both. At this point, my sources tell me here in 2024 that the Big Ten definitely would welcome the Florida State Seminoles. Just as it took a while for a certain Big Ten committee to fully vet Oregon, Southern Cal, Washington, UCLA, preliminary conversations. We like what you have to offer. We'd be open to the idea. Preliminary conversations have to move eventually to the point of being vetted by university presidents, university chancellors, TV partners, etc. I don't believe that had happened with Florida State in the Big Ten last year. I believe it has happened probably in January of this year. They went from the hypothetical sounds good kind of fuzzy conversation to more of, yes, if FSU is available under these circumstances, we, the Big Ten, will invite them to be a member. I believe that's where we are now. Now, again, the details of Florida State's departure still do matter, because it would impact the nature of the Big Ten's invitation to the Seminoles. But at some point in the last 6 months, Florida State went from thinking and hoping it would have a landing place in the Big Ten when push comes to shove to knowing that it will have a landing place in the Big Ten. Exactly when? Not yet certain. Under exactly what financial parameters? Not yet certain. But obviously, it's a huge relief to know that you have a very lucrative landing place in the form of the Big Ten. That means the Big Ten presidents and chancellors okayed the Seminoles in both the academic and athletic contexts, and it means the Big Ten TV partners have given at least that preliminary green light to the Seminoles for obvious reasons. They are the biggest football TV brand in the ACC. My understanding is that Florida State has cleared that hurdle, if you will. If FSU gets out at a low price and owns all of its media rights, it's a very simple transaction with the Big Ten. If the lawsuits do not have end results that are favorable to the Seminoles, the details do get more complicated, but that doesn't make it an impossibility. By the way, I know some people roll their eyes whenever we mention academics on this show or in any other context, but such things definitely do matter in the eyes of university presidents and chancellors, the people who actually pull the ultimate triggers on these decisions. I'm not sure how many sports fans realize this, but when Florida State joined the ACC in the early 1990s, and I was already covering the league back then, FSU was not yet a prominent, well-respected university. Everybody respected Bobby Bowden, the legendary football coach. Everybody respected the Seminoles football program for obvious reasons. And that's why the ACC wanted to add the Seminoles back then. They desperately needed to upgrade their football product, and they did, in part by adding the Seminoles and others. But a lot of ACC presidents in the early 1990s, they were sort of holding their noses because they just did not perceive FSU as a peer institution, terminology that academics use a lot. And the Seminoles just did not fit academically alongside prominent private universities like Duke and Wake Forest, or even top 5 in the nation public universities. That's where they are in the rankings, like UNC and UVA, among others who have high academic standards throughout the ACC. So there was a hold the nose factor, but the need for football, the need for finances overcame the hold the nose factor. I mention this because a lot of folks who just only focus on sports and don't either care or follow any of this other stuff, over the last 30 years, Florida State has dramatically upgraded its reputation academically. FSU is now considered a top 25 public university, and it is considered a really impactful research institution. Again, both of those things were not the case in the 1990s. The current version of the Big Ten has the following schools ranked in the top 25 public universities in America. Again, put aside the private schools for a minute. Top 25 public universities. There's a lot of Big Ten schools on this list. Ready? Incoming UCLA, tied for first in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Michigan, number 3 in those rankings. Illinois, 12. Wisconsin, tied for 12th. Rutgers, 15th. Incoming Big Ten member Washington, tied for 15th. Ohio State, 17th. Purdue, tied for 17th. Again, national rankings of public universities. Maryland, 19th. Minnesota, 23rd. All right, that's 10. We're already at 10 Big Ten schools just in the top 25. FSU is now ranked number 23, tied with Minnesota on that same list. Michigan State, is number 28 in those rankings. Penn State is tied for number 28. So now, and when you add, by the way, Northwestern's a private university, obviously an elite institution. Southern Cal incoming to the Big Ten, private university, elite institution. Now I'm up to 14 schools, I think I just listed, that are very highly regarded academically. That's a large majority of the Big Ten. And the new and improved 2024 version of Florida State actually fits into that picture quite nicely on the academic side of things. On the athletic sides, obviously, we all know the Seminoles are the biggest football TV draw in the entire ACC. They're one of the better ones nationally, and they would add a massive population to the Big Ten's footprint. And those are obviously huge factors in today's realignment landscape. Just to mention that footprint, by the way, the Seminoles, one of the many reasons they have a home waiting for them in the Big Ten, the state of Florida is extremely desirable to the Big Ten's TV partners. That is not yet part of the Big Ten footprint. They do now stretch from the Pacific Ocean, those new California, Oregon, Washington schools, to the Atlantic Ocean, right? Rutgers, based in New Jersey, is a member of the Big Ten. So they're truly coast to coast, but they certainly don't have the Southeast. And they certainly don't have the incredibly populous state of Florida. Well, Florida State would bring that, right? The Big Ten just got into California, which, this is not mere coincidence, is the most populous state in the United States and has almost 40 million people. That is by far the largest state in our union. They got into California through the additions of national brands, statewide brands, UCLA and Southern Cal. These things give enormous boost to the value of both the Big Ten network and the audiences available to Fox and the Big Ten's other TV partners. It's just a no-brainer. Florida is the 3rd most populous state in the country with almost 23 million people. So just as those Western schools had to make sense footprint-wise, academically, and athletically, so would anybody else. For the reasons I just described, Florida State is viewed as that great fit for the Big Ten. And I think there's a great chance that the Seminoles at some point become Big Ten school number 19. They're going to be at 18 with this summer's additions. Finally, on the legal side, there's some really, really bad social media lawyering going on out there. I will not get into all of the nonsensical stuff that I see as an attorney myself since 1994. But as these 5 lawsuits continue to unfold, a lot of people are either trying to jump to certain legal conclusions well before the evidence justifies those conclusions, or in some cases, they're just making up nonsense, assumedly for clicks or viewers or whatever other things the grifters and the con artists of the media world do in sports and in many other contexts. For example, there are people I assume are not attorneys suggesting that because Article 3, Section 2 of the United States Constitution, because of that text, they're suggesting that the appropriate venue for the FSU ACC lawsuit is the United States Supreme Court. This is a patently ridiculous idea, and I will not get into all of the reasons why, but here's a quick primer. There are 2 basic ways to get your case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. One, through a very, very long and typically extremely expensive multi-year appeals process after multiple decisions in lower courts, where the ACC lawsuits are right now, right? Lower courts in North Carolina, lower courts in South Carolina, lower courts in Florida. And even then, if you work your way through up the system, the United States Supreme Court takes only a tiny percentage of the cases it is asked to hear on appeal. The only other way, there is no door number 3. There is no third road to the top of the mountain. There's just 2. The only other way to get your case in front of the 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court is to request what's called original jurisdiction. This means that the facts of the case are so unusual that they fit into this tiny, very, very, very narrow category of cases that can be heard by only the United States Supreme Court. The classic example of this is when one state is suing another state. For example, New York and New Jersey are neighbors, right? They are connected to one another. There's actually a famous case. It's called New York v. New Jersey, state v. state. In those very rare situations, the case actually goes immediately to the United States Supreme Court because the Constitution says that's the appropriate forum when the parties are 2 or more different states. It's not just the right jurisdiction, it's the original jurisdiction in those narrow sets of facts. The problem here, of course, is that only one side of the lawsuit is an extension of the state government here. Yes, Florida State University, as a public university, is considered an extension of the state of Florida for these purposes. Same with Clemson in the state of South Carolina. However, the Atlantic Coast Conference is not and has not been an extension of any government. It is a private entity. It is not a governmental actor. It is not an extension of any state government. That means original jurisdiction in front of the United States Supreme Court is inappropriate for these cases and simply not supported by legal precedent. As attorneys, we're trained to say never, but I don't see a shred of evidence suggesting that the United States Supreme Court should take this case on the grounds of original jurisdiction. I've been asked, is there any chance? People love these questions. Is there any chance, DG, that eventually these ACC lawsuits could end up in front of the United States Supreme Court? Well, the answer has to be yes, but it's such a tiny chance that I feel misleading when I say yes. As I said before, I believe these cases eventually will end up in a legal settlement, not a judicial conclusion. But just as a wild hypothetical, let's say that magically a court in Florida, a court in South Carolina, and a court in North Carolina, or let's even say they're appeals courts, they come to different conclusions on mostly the same sets of facts at some point down the road. And let's say magically these cases are all decided on the same day. Then you'd have an oddball question of which state's ruling is the one that actually applies, right? You have 3 ongoing sets of lawsuits in 3 different states. What if magically they all came to different conclusions on the same day? Well, everyone's heard the phrase race to the courthouse by now. Usually when the same set of facts is involved in multiple lawsuits in multiple states, as a matter of respect, and so as not to burn or duplicate judicial resources, the second and third states typically back off and let the first filed case play out in that first state. But because that is a policy, it's a matter of discretion. It is not a requirement of law. It didn't go that way this time. The judge in Florida did not say, well, the ACC filed first in North Carolina, so we're just going to let that case play out, and we'll all have to live by its conclusions and its judicial rulings. The Florida judge, in most cases, would have done that. In this case, he did not do that. Same with South Carolina. So these issues are playing out in 3 different jurisdictions, mostly the same facts, but there are some state laws involved, which makes some parts of the lawsuits different from venue A to venue B or venue C. Believe it or not, and I feel weird to say this out loud, but as a general rule in our country, in these situations, as a general rule, whoever comes to a judicial conclusion first becomes the law of the land. I know this sounds strange, but let's say a year from now, one of these 3 states, North Carolina, South Carolina, or Florida, the case makes it all the way through to, I'll call it a judicial conclusion. Even though those other 2, whichever 2 aren't finished yet, just used a lot of time and a lot of legal fees and a lot of judicial resources on mostly the same facts, those 2 cases become irrelevant because, thanks to the United States Constitution, when one state comes to an ultimate conclusion, the other 49 states have to follow that precedent as a general rule. God knows there are exceptions. But it sounds crazy that the first to a conclusion wins and the other 2 are mostly dead, but that is how it works when, as here, 3 states and 3 sets of judges decide to continue forward simultaneously. One more quick legal thing. Some are suggesting that the grant of rights is already dead, that Clemson and Florida State, behind closed doors, behind the curtains, their lawyers have somehow won the argument that the language of that contract, with a heavy emphasis on the word necessary, allows them to leave and leave with their media rights whenever they choose. That is definitely one of the legal arguments of Clemson and Florida State, but according to my sources, that issue has definitely not been resolved legally yet, and I'm not sure why some otherwise smart people are telling you that it has. Just as Clemson and Florida State are pounding the word necessary, judges are asked to read the entirety of a contract in the sport of in the area of contract law. And for example, the words on the grant of rights say through 2036, whether or not I'm still a member of this league. I mean, one side's arguing that the word necessary makes everything else clear. The other side's arguing that the words, I'm bound to you and you have my media rights and I have assigned them to you through 2036, whether or not I remain a member. Like, those are the words in the actual document. I have the document. Seems pretty clear on the ACC's side of the argument, right? Let's let those things continue to play out. Those who have declared the grant of rights dead, I think, are being irresponsible. And if to be as nice as possible, they're being highly premature and speculative. One quick reminder, all of the schools leaving the Pac-12 this summer, for either the Big 12 or the Big 10 or the ACC, they're all leaving when? After the expiration of that league's grant of rights, which has language similar to the language in the ACC's grant of rights. Texas, this is very important, and a lot of media are getting this wrong. Texas and Oklahoma signed a grant of rights in the Big 12. They wanted to leave years ago, but because they can read and because they know that the league has a pretty good argument when you say, yeah, you have my rights all the way through this date, even if I leave early. Again, I'm not promising you how those cases in Florida and South Carolina are going to turn out. I'm just telling you the ACC has a really good argument, just like the Big 12 and the Pac-12 had really good arguments. So nobody got out early in the Pac-12. When Texas and Oklahoma this summer are joining the SEC from the Big 12, they wanted to leave years ago. They didn't. They waited until 1 year before the expiration of their grant of rights. And guess what? This is very important. in the upcoming 2024 calendar or academic year, 24-25, the Longhorns and the Sooners are receiving what's called Tier 1 media rights money from neither the Big 12, the league they're leaving, nor the Southeastern Conference, the league they're joining. Why? Because of the freaking grant of rights, folks. The 1-year gap was created by the Big 12's grant of rights, which uses mostly the same language as the ACC's grant of rights. Now, just to be clear, I'm going to be fully transparent and accurate here in ways that the grifters and the con artists are not. Texas and Oklahoma did figure out ways around this financial problem. They did get out a year early, and they leaned on other sources of revenue from their new league in some cases, from TV partners in other cases, to make up for this big freaking hole. There's a 1-year period where Texas and Oklahoma are not getting a dime of Tier 1 media rights from the Big 12, nor a dime of Tier 1 media rights money from the SEC. Just a 1-year gap, and they did find creative ways to fill that gap. But I think we could all agree, common sense would tell you, it is far less complicated to fill a 1-year gap than it is to fill a 12-year gap or a 10-year gap. In the ACC's case, the grant of rights language specifically includes through 2036, still 12 years away. That is a very big gap. I'm aware of the argument about suggesting that legally the contract is only through 2027 because of the terms of that contract that we haven't seen yet. It does make the Clemson and Florida State cases more complicated in the short term because we don't know how courts are going to interpret that clause, whatever it is that we haven't seen for ESPN's option, exercised by February 2025. But the current deal is through 2027, and that option, if that's the appropriate term, is for the following 9 years. Regardless, it's far more complicated to fill the gap over 10 or 12 years. It's far more complicated to try to win this argument because, remember, Texas and Oklahoma didn't try to win that legal argument. They waited till near the end of the grant of rights, and then they found creative ways to make up for the financial gap. The FSU case, the FSU versus ACC case in front of a Florida judge has another big day coming up on June 18th. The ACC Clemson case has another big day in front of a North Carolina judge on July 2nd. I wouldn't draw too many legal conclusions before those 2 days, allow for a little bit more progress, and maybe not even until after those meetings, depending on how those dates go in June and early July. I know why everybody wants answers as quickly as possible, but I continue to believe that the responsible people covering this stuff are not jumping to the same legal conclusions that some of the caveman lawyers out there on social media are doing right now.